Rapture Detention, 1956. Sullivan was worried about Head Constable Harker. The HC was breathing through his mouth like a man who'd just finished a 2-mile run, but Sullivan knew damn well he'd been sitting at that desk for at least half an hour. One of Harker's cigars, still smoking, was just a butt in the seashell ashtray. Harker sat there, panting, staring into space, drumming his freckled fingers on the desk. The head constable was a short, thick, jowly man with receding hair, a shabby black suit. Looked like he hadn't shaved in a couple days.
"You asked me to come over, Harker, remember?" Sullivan said, sitting across from him. "You okay? You look kinda worse for wear."
"Sure, I'm okay." Harker reached up unconsciously, fingering the constable's badge on his lapel. I just sometimes wonder. He glanced at the door to make sure it was closed. If I made a mistake coming to Rapture. Sullivan chuckled.
"Don't feel like the Lone Ranger on that one. Don't know many who don't feel that way sometimes."
Harker nodded, too rapidly.
"But there's still some true believers, Chief. Like Rizzo, Wallace, Ryan, of course, that crackpot Sander Cohen, maybe McDonough. Of course, we lost some too. Like Greavy."
Harker sighed.
"Yeah, shame about Greavy. Too confident, strutting around like he owned the place. They nearly got McDonough, too."
"I don't know. I don't have a good feeling about it, Chief. I'm grateful you got me this post, but I should have stuck around in the States. I don't know. Gone into something else."
"Me and you, we're badges, pal. Too old to change."
He could see Harker was scared. Plenty scared.
"What is it? I mean, there's something that's got you off balance here. Something in particular. Why'd you call me over here?"
Harker rubbed a thumbnail raspily over his 2 days' growth of beard and reached into the desk drawer. He took out a pistol, stood up, stuck the pistol in his coat pocket, and said,
I'll show you. Come on."
They went into the corridor. Karlowski was waiting out there with a pump shotgun in his hands. Sullivan kept the Russian close when the great man didn't need him. Yesterday, that pump shotgun had cut a spider splicer nearly in half, and saved Sullivan's neck. Karlowski nodded at Harker, who just grunted and brushed past him, stumping down the hall on his short, thick legs, one hand in his coat pocket on that gun. The head constable led them around a corner, past a black guard who unlocked a hallway door to let them into the cell block. They strode past a series of insulated locked cells, all on the left-hand side, where splicers, low enough on Eve to be containable, babbled and begged for their plasmids. This place was grimier and crazier than Persephone. The isolation facility wasn't full of splicer crazies anyhow, just political eccentrics. At last, Harker stopped near cell 15, where a hulking constable with nervous blue eyes and a leering smile leaned on the hallway's metal wall, a Tommy gun cradled in his arms.
"Howdy, Chief," Cavendish said.
"A little over an hour ago," Harker said in a low voice as Sullivan and Karlowski caught up with him at the cell door. "We bring in an unconscious splicer, right? Half naked, a lot of plasmid deformities in his face and all. Well, when we found this cocksucker, he had some kind of fish-gutting hook in one hand, all covered with blood, and in the other hand he's got a woman's head. Her head. Cut off her body. You get me? Sliced off, just under the chin. Slick as a whistle. A brunette. Might have been a pretty woman. I think maybe I saw this chippy dancing over at that strip joint in Fort Frolic."
He licked his lips, glanced down at the hall towards cell 18.
"Well, this splicer, he's kind of squeezing her head to his chest. Looked like a kid hugging a baby doll. And he was sawing logs, this guy, snoring. Pat Cavendish there gets him cuffed and tries to wake him up, but the guy's too sacked out. So Patrick gets some help, brings the son of a bitch up here, puts him in cell 17 over there. We got the broad's head in a freezer if you want an idea."
"Okay,"
Sullivan said, shrugging.
"Not the only homicidal splicer we've had. Pretty crazy, but lots of them are. He must have run out of Eve, got tired, plasmids needed recharging, took a snooze. So now you got him. Ryan's talking about turning guys like this over to Gil Alexander for his experiments. We can get him to a judge in the morning."
Cavendish gave out a chuckling sound of contempt.
Boyo, have you got it wrong?
Sullivan didn't like Cavendish's tone, but he didn't like Cavendish at all. Half Irish, half Suffolk Brit. Grinned like a wolf, liked to beat up prisoners, but a good man in a fight.
He ain't run out of anything,
Cavendish went on.
Drank himself to sleep, I figure. That's what it smelled like. Woke up still charged. He was in 18 last I looked.
What do you mean, last you looked?
There's a new plasmid on the market, Harker put in, almost whispering, eyes darting to the door of 18. Only it's kinda black market. Fontaine hasn't released it publicly. It's supposed to make them extra crazy in record time, for one thing. For another, might be the most dangerous one around, if you think about it. Only I figure these guys are probably too nuts to use it against the council. They're all about going with their impulses.
Use what? Karlovsky asked impatiently.
They can disappear, Harker said, and go somewhere else. This guy, he comes in and out of that cell as he pleases, Pat. What do they call that plasmid?
Teleport.
And exactly at that moment, a sucking sound made them all look towards cell 18. Specks of free-floating blackness appeared in the air. Sparkles of energy took on the approximate shape of a man, and the sound increased till it ended in a shoomp, as a man appeared out of nowhere. He was a pale man, barefoot, naked from the waist down, wearing only a filthy, blood-stained work shirt. His hair was patchy brown. The angular face was hard to make out under all the plasmid excrescences. One of the growths had nearly blotted out his left eye.
Hey, you dog humpers is keeping me awake out here,
he snarled, spraying spittle past his snaggly yellow teeth.
I'm trying to finish my nap, for fuck's sake. Well, ain't you the pips with your pretty badges? I want me one.
Karlovsky, Cavendish, Harker, and Sullivan were all bringing their guns to bear. A Tommy gun, a shotgun, and 2 pistols pointed at an empty space. Empty because the splicer had teleported out of it. He still had plenty of Eve, and he had vanished, and reappeared behind Karlovsky. He pulled Karlovsky's hair, hooting gleefully as the Russian spun towards him with the shotgun. The splicer vanished again, twinkling away. Only to reappear, bringing a nasty smell and posing like a dancer between Sullivan and the wall, yanking Sullivan's right ear and cackling, "Hiya, Chief!"
Bastard acts like one of them cartoons in the movies,
Sullivan thought. He made a grab for the splicer and felt his fingers pass through air that crackled with departing energy. He turned to see the splicer grabbing the pistol from Harker with one hand, with the other tearing the constable's badge off. Sullivan got his pistol into play and fired at the splicer, squeezing the trigger a split second too late. The bullet passed through the place where the teleporter had been, ricocheting off the steel walls near Harker. The sucking sound came again, and then a flash of light from cell window 18. Harker made a plaintive little eep sound, a noise you'd never expect from him. Then he gasped as he slid down the wall, leaving a smear of blood. He fell on his face, squirming, groaning. The ricochet from Sullivan's gun had hit the constable, and hard.
"Damn it, Harker,"
Sullivan sputtered, as if it were Harker's fault.
I'm sorry, I just..."
Harker gasped again.
"Get the fucker."
Tommy gun raised, Cavendish was stalking towards the window of cell 18. He peered through the small barred window in the studded metal door, and his head jerked back with the bang of a gunshot from the inside. Sullivan thought at first Cavendish was dead, but then he saw the constable was just missing part of his left ear. Much of it shot away. Cavendish crouched down in the corridor, put a hand over his red, streaming ear, hissing with pain.
"Fuck."
Too bad I missed. I could have improved your ugly fucking face to have a bullet through it, dog humper. Yeah, I gotta recommend that one to Steinman.
Sullivan cocked his pistol, moving in a half-crouch down the row of cells. He ignored the bearded splicer in number 16, who taunted,
"You see, if you'd given us our Adam, we'd all be happy harpies. But right now you've made us into saddy soddies. And sadness hurts. It hurts. Going to hurt and hurt."
"It's me that's done the hurting so far today,"
Sullivan thought glumly. He'd accidentally shot Harker. This teleport thing had him shaken. He saw now why Harker'd been so unnerved. He approached the cell door obliquely, pistol raised, trying to peer in without making himself a target. There, the semi-nude splicer was relaxing on his back in a cot against the further wall of the padded room, his naked genitals spattered with dry blood, all too clearly on display. He had his left arm behind his head, his right arm up, and he was spinning the pistol on his index finger and singing a Rapture advertising jingle to himself.
Oh, the beer may be green, but it's mighty keen. It satisfies a man, makes him feel grand. It's Ryan's own, Ryan's own, Ryan's own beer.
The splicer stopped spinning the gun and fired it towards the barred window of the cell. The bullet struck a bar and ricocheted down the corridor. Sullivan ducked, though the bullet was already on its way by then. He raised slowly up, only to hear that sucking sound, and Cavendish yelling, "Down, Chief!" He flattened belly down on the floor, and saw out of the corner of his eye the splicer materializing over him to his right, the pistol pointed down to shoot him in the head. A rat-a-tat echoed harshly from the corridor, along with the big thump of a shotgun, and the splicer was stumbling backward, stitched across the middle of the blood-spouting bullet holes. Right arm torn half off from a shotgun blast. No! Cavendish had gotten him square with the Tommy gun, and Karlowski had clipped him good with the shotgun. Someone around the corner yelled in pain as part of the Tommy gun burst ricocheted down the corridor. Maybe the steel walls hadn't been such a good idea. Sullivan got up again, coughing with the gun smoke in the small space. Yips and jeers and shouts of derision came from the adjoining cells, but the teleport splicer was twitching, gurgling in death.
Well, we got him. But we lost Harker,
Sullivan muttered, turning to look at the dead constable.
This is a whole new... how do you say it? From baseball,
Karlowski said, looking down at the twitching splicer. Sullivan nodded.
A whole new ballgame.
Footlight Theater, 1956. Frank Fontaine took his seat near the stage in the small auditorium of the Footlight Theater. He was here to see Sander Cohen's new cabaret production, Janice. Cohen promoted it as a tragic farce about identity. It was actually an oddball collaboration between Sander Cohen and the surgeon, Steinman. But Fontaine's mind was elsewhere. He was remembering something Ryan had said.
even ideas can be contraband.
Settling into the plush seat, Fontaine smiled to himself. Ironically, Ryan had sparked an idea with that little phrase. Spread the right subversive belief, it could turn this place on its head, could dump Ryan at the bottom, lift Frank Fontaine to the top. Feeling overfull from his dinner, a little drunk from the wine, Fontaine glanced over his shoulder at the audience crowding into the small theater. There was Steinman, the surgeon, overdressed in a tuxedo, playing author. There was Diane Mclintock, standing at the head of the aisle, in the doorway. She wore a low-cut, red-beaded black frock, carried a matching beaded purse. She was frowning, looking at her diamond-crusted watch. Waiting for Ryan, no doubt. She was Ryan's fiancée, as well as his receptionist. 2 seats were empty, right next to Fontaine. This might be a great opportunity. He stood up and waved to Diane, though he scarcely knew the woman. He pointed at the 2 seats, smiling. She glanced through the door to the lobby, then nodded briskly, her lips pursed, and hurried down to him. "Mr. Fontaine."
Miss Mclintock?
He stepped aside so she could take a seat.
"I've saved a spot for Andrew, too," he said.
"If he ever shows up,"
Diane muttered, sitting down.
"He's always so busy."
He sat beside her.
"I understand someone might be announcing a wedding soon."
She snorted, then remembered herself.
"Oh, yes. When he decides the time is right, we'll make the announcement."
She opened her purse.
"You wouldn't have a cigarette?" "Oh, bother. I seem to be all out."
Fontaine noticed that most of the purse was taken up by a book.
"I do have a cigarette for you,"
he said.
complete with Fontaine Futuristics matchbook. Very stylish. He held the case out. She took a cigarette, and he lit it for her.
You're a lifesaver.
Looks like you're carrying books around in that thing. Does it make a better weapon that way? She blew smoke at the ceiling.
No need to be dismissive of a woman's desire to learn. I'm reading a Fitzgerald novel from the 20s, The Beautiful and the Damned.
He thought, what could be more fitting? But winking at her, he said, one thing I'm not dismissive of is a woman's desires. She looked at him with narrowed eyes, as if thinking of bringing him up short. Then she gave way to a titter of laughter.
Oh gosh, that kind of remark, a woman's desires, makes me feel like I was back working the club where Andrew and I met.
She glanced over her shoulder.
You haven't seen him here, have you?
Afraid not.
Maybe he ought to let her know, obliquely, that he might be available to squire her if Ryan gave her the brush off. She could be useful.
If he doesn't show up, I'll heroically offer you my arm, man, and escort you from here all the way to the moon and back.
It's even farther to the moon than it used to be down here,
she said, but she seemed pleased. She glanced back at the door again and then stepped on her cigarette as the curtains parted.
Show's starting,
she sighed. It took him a moment to recognize Sander Cohen, as made up as he was, and with another face entirely slung on the back of his head. Cohen was dressed in skin-tight Lincoln green, had an absurd mustache and beard, and a feeble little bow and arrows slung over his shoulder. He pranced to mandolin music in front of a painted forest backdrop and broke into a song about how he loved to be in Greenwood with my merry men. Oh, my gay and merry men, my oh so happy men. And then came along that dreadful bitch known as Maid Marian, and oh, how paradise had fallen. His merry men, looking more like nearly naked Greek wrestlers, came dancing out of the wood, waving arrows and singing the chorus with him.
Oh, Jesus wept,
Fontaine thought. Then the King of England came along, wearing a lion-blazoned cloak, a gold-painted crown, and a red beard that was coming loose from his chin. He brought Cohen to his castle and set him to be the new sheriff of Nottingham. Robin Hood lost a little time in assassinating the king, merely stabbing him to the beat of the song, and then switching the face on the back of his head around to the front. The mask resembled the king. He dragged the body off and took the king's place. The one-act musical mercifully ended to a smattering of applause, although Dr. Steinman stood up, clapped lustily, and shouted, "Bravo! Bravissimo!" Fontaine helped Diane into her wrap. Maybe he could get her to a bar. After a few drinks, she might remember her cigarette girl origins. But suddenly, Ryan was coming down the aisle, shaking hands with people, nodding, waving to Diane. "Sorry I'm late, darling." So much for that. But the evening wasn't a bust. Despite having to watch Cohen flounce about, the play had given Fontaine an idea. On the way out of the theater, he paused to gaze at one of Ryan's earliest propaganda posters. "Rapture is the hope of the world," it declared over a picture of Andrew Ryan, holding the world on his shoulders. Andrew Ryan as Atlas. Looking down to see that no one was watching, Frank Fontaine took the poster down. Bill McDonough's flat, 1956. Sitting on his sofa near the big sea-view window, Bill McDonough wondered if keeping records of his thoughts and impressions on life in Rapture was really a good idea. He'd tried it for a while, but it didn't come naturally. Ryan was pushing for everyone to keep recordings of their problems, their plans for some kind of planned historical retrospective, and it was becoming something of a fad, but Bill was starting to wonder exactly how it might be used against a man. The tape recorder was sitting on the coffee table by a mug of greenish beer. Neither seemed appealing. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 7. Elaine would be home from Arcadia with the little one soon enough. If he was going to do this, he'd better get to it. He reached for the tape recorder, but somehow his hand found his way to the mug of beer instead. He sighed, put down the beer, pressed the record button on the device, and began.
Rapture's changing, but Ryan can't see the wolves in the woods. This Fontaine fellow, he's a crook and a proper tea leaf, but he's got the atom and that makes him the governor. He's sinking the profits back into bigger and better plasmids, and building them from Fontaine poorhouses, more like Fontaine recruiting centers. Before we know it, bloke's gonna have an army of splicers, and we're gonna have ourselves a whole heap of miseries.
He switched off the tape recorder. There was a lot more on his mind, but he was reluctant to make his doubts about Rapture a matter of record. The phone on the coffee table rang. He answered the phone.
Right, Bill here.
McDonough, it's Sullivan. We've had another 3 killings in the upper atrium, and the council is calling an emergency meeting.
Council conference room, 1956. Andrew Ryan wasn't sure he wanted this special meeting of the Rapture Council, but he was reassured to see Bill McDonough and Sullivan come in. He still felt he could trust those two. Only 6 people had shown up this time, and they were gathered around the oval conference table in the ornate, gold-trimmed little room near the top of the highest air scraper in Rapture. Anna, Bill, Sullivan, Anton Kincaid, Ryan, Rizzo. Ryan missed the presence of Reuben Greavy, and he could have done without Anna Culpepper, who liked to put her oar in without having anything useful to say. He should have never allowed her on the council. Ryan toyed with an untasted cup of coffee, feeling his age. His role as Rapture's guide and mentor was becoming a weight. He could almost feel it pinching his back, making his bones creak. And some on the council were making it worse, always prodding at him with their feeble little ideas. Meanwhile, Rapture's problems had become Andrew Ryan's. Crime, subversives, foolish use of plasmids, constant maintenance problems. These required real vision to overcome. He was seeing that more and more clearly. A man needed a willingness to institute big solutions to big problems.
We're so close to the surface here,
Anna said, sitting down with a cup of tea.
It makes me think it wouldn't be so bad to have a few excursions to the surface world just close by. On a boat, I mean.
She looked up at the glass ceiling, just a yard or two under the surface of the ocean. Moonlight penetrated the waves, came glimmering down to color the room's electric illumination with a blue-white paleness, making Anna gaze upward, look as if she'd put on whiteface. That made Ryan think about Sander Cohen. He was glad Cohen hadn't come. The performer was getting ever more socially peculiar. He'd sent a jet postal note begging off with some enigmatic excuse about being caught up in the hunt for art, which must be captivated, bound to the stage, in preparation for the Titanakami. Whatever was he talking about? Ryan glanced up as a shadow passed over them. The silhouette of a large, sleek shark swarm overhead, circling the lighted room in curiosity. "In time," Ryan said. "We may have excursion, Anna. All in good time." Anna sighed and gave him that pitying look he'd found so infuriating lately.
Dare I point out, it has been 10 years since Hiroshima. There have been no farther uses of atomic weapons. The war, it appears, is a cold one. That's what our radio tells us.
Rizzo sniffed disapprovingly at her skepticism. "Ruskies have been stockpiling A-bombs just the same as the US of A, Miss Culpepper. Why, it's a tinderbox out there. The commies are taking over China. The Soviets got their agents every goddamn place, only a matter of time before the atomic war comes." "Exactly," Ryan said. Good old Rizzo, a sensible man. "And that aside, we have to remain as hidden away here as we can. We don't want anybody taking notice of anything out here. The lighthouse is risky enough. If it weren't for the air draw..." Ryan changed the subject. "Let's get to it. We have to decide on a policy about all of this violence." "It's simple, boss," Sullivan said, leaning his elbows on the table, a pinched look on his face. "We've got to ban plasmids.
I know how you feel about banning products, but we've got no choice. You're talking about atomic power? I'm not sure that these plasmids are any safer than that stuff.
Sullivan's words were slurring, ever so slightly. He'd been drinking before the meeting. Ryan reached for patience. Chief, I know it was hard for you to lose Harker that way, but the market has a life of its own, and we can't choke that life off with bans or even... He had a difficulty actually saying the word. Regulations. The solution is simple. Ryan Enterprises is now in the plasmid business. A better product will draw people in, and they'll buy one that doesn't affect their minds. He glanced at Bill, thinking he looked weary and troubled. What do you think, Bill?
You're seriously going into plasmids, Gov?
Bill asked, seeming genuinely surprised.
It'll take more time to develop a plasmid that doesn't have side effects. Meanwhile...
Bill, it's either we go into them or ban them, and how well did the prohibition work?
But they're addictive.
So is alcohol. Bill shook his head.
Look, what happened to Mr. Greavy, if you'd seen it?
Yes. Reuben Greavy's death was a painful subject for Ryan. Yes, that was a great loss to me. He was an artist, an entrepreneur, a scientist, a true Renaissance man, a great loss. I feel responsible. I should have sent security along with him, but he would insist on going wherever he liked in Rapture.
I was the one with him,
Bill said, looking very unhappy.
If anyone's responsible, the only one responsible,
growled Sullivan,
is that telekinetic bitch that killed him. But, Mr. Ryan, if you want to continue allowing plasmid sales and get Ryan Industries into it...
He shook his head, wincing at the thought.
Then it's got to be regulated.
We'll consider restricting some plasmids, Ryan said, though he had no intention of really restricting any plasmids. This is a rough, transitional period to be expected, part of the tumults of the market.
Do we even know for sure which plasmids are out there?
Kincaid asked. Sullivan shrugged.
Not for sure. I've got a partial list.
He searched his pockets, looking at it.
Got it here somewhere. Some kind of black market, some Fontaine sells in shops. He's selling Eve right next to it. Damn floors are littered with syringes. Here it is.
He unfolded a wrinkled piece of paper.
Electrobolt. Fires bolts of electricity. Can stun a man or kill him. Incinerate. Started with a plasmid you could use for cooking, but now it's sort of like a flamethrower. Comes out of your hand. I've seen teleport. Not sure how we can control that one. It's a big worry. I mean, Christ, how do you jail someone who can teleport? Telekinesis. That's what killed Mr. Greavy. You've all seen that. There's Winter's Blast. Sends out a current. Super cold air. Freezes your enemy solid. And there's that spider thing they go up the walls with. Lots of those creeps around.
Ah, creeps, Anna said, absently glancing at the transparent ceiling. They do creep, don't they? Good one, Chief. He looked at her in puzzlement. He hadn't been joking.
What about this teleport? Bill asked. What do we do about the bloody Houdini splicers? Can't be legal.
Ryan nodded. He didn't trust it either. It weakened security. It might enable people to leave Rapture. He had security cameras and turrets set up at the only egresses to Rapture to stop anyone unauthorized from leaving. He was in the process of installing more security bots. Some plasmids could make a joke of all those wonderfully engineered devices. We'll see what we can do to suppress that one. Kincaid tried to straighten his tie and only made it more crooked.
I don't understand the physics of these plasmids. Where are these new atom cells drawing all the energy from? If the splicer shoots out flame, does it come from his intestinal methane? Where does he get the raw materials? Does he lose a pound after using it?
Bill looked at him.
You're buffing. No theories then.
Kincaid shrugged.
I can only speculate that all this extra energy is being drawn from the splicer's environment in some way. The air around us is charged after all. That could account for the electrobolt, the mutagenic cells, once redesigned by Adam, have sort of a secondary mitochondria that might provide specialized energy emissions. We don't know what most of our genes do. Some might be designed for these powers, which might even account for tales of supernatural beings, genies, magicians, and the like, but those mutations didn't work out, you see, perhaps because they tended to be burdened by negative side effects like psychosis, facial excrescencies, and so on. Bit of a dodgy omen then, isn't it, Kincaid? Bill pointed out. I mean, if these mutations existed in the past and they didn't make it, didn't work out then, might not work out for Rapture then. Something in that, Kincaid allowed, nodding slightly. But Mr. Ryan is right. If it's possible to create plasmids, then it should be possible to perfect them. We can work out the bad parts. Just imagine having rational control of telekinesis or the ability to climb walls like a fly, to hurl electricity, to become superhuman. It's wonderful in its own way. Maybe people could just learn to use Adam without overindulging, Anna suggested. An education program. Finally, Ryan thought. Anna had said something useful. Not a bad idea. We'll look into that.
The side effects of plasmids, Sullivan pointed out, are the only thing keeping more people from buying Adam. We fix the side effects, we'll have superpowered people everywhere. We'll all have to do it just to keep some kind of balance of power. I don't want to cough fire every time I belch.
Bill nodded eagerly. Chief Sullivan's in the right of it. Side effects or not, plasmids are just too dangerous. Rapture is made of mostly metal, but it's complex, and that makes it vulnerable, fragile in some places. Daft bastards running around, shooting fire, blasting lightning about, they could bring down the whole bloody house of cards. Ryan made a dismissive gesture. We'll get the splicers under control. Meanwhile, he added musingly, this is all part of our evolution. Just growing pains. He considered explaining fully, but they wouldn't understand if he told them what he really thought. Greavy had understood, though. He'd understood the winnowing, the subtraction of weak links from the great chain. What they were going through in Rapture now was the heat of a welding torch, both destructive and constructive.
It isn't just the superpowered sons of bitches,
Sullivan growled, crumpling the list of plasmids in his shaky hands.
It's the leadheads, rampaging around the city, shooting guns at random, faster reflexes from all that Adam. We've had to kill 4 in the last 2 days. Sad thing is, they all had kids, transferred to that new orphanage of Fontaine's.
Fontaine, Bill said, looking at Ryan significantly.
Got a finger in every bloody thing, every kind of smuggling. He's not just bringing in cheap hooch and Bibles anymore, Governor.
Ryan grunted. How's the evidence looking on Fontaine's smugglers? Sullivan sat up straighter, suddenly energized.
I've got enough to raid him, Mr. Ryan. Then we'll have the proof. I've got a witness to the smuggling ring up in detention, under protection.
Then put it together, Ryan said. We'll raid his operation and see what we get. Kincaid shook his head.
All that charity stuff he's behind, you've got to wonder what he's up to.
He's up to undermining me, Ryan said bitterly. Charity is a form of socialism. It's too much like that Lamb woman. If they're not working together, then they will be in time. Like Lenin recruiting Stalin. Stopping Fontaine stops this propaganda tool he calls charity. What about this plasmid business? Rizzo asked. We don't want to ban them or regulate them. So how do we control them?
Now that is a good question, mate,
Bill said. I am about to announce a new Ryan Enterprises product line, Ryan said, smiling in a way that he hoped was reassuring. A new line of weapons. Chemical throwers, flamethrowers, grenade launchers, better machine guns. We can use weapons innovation to counterbalance the splicers until we get Adam perfected.
Bill shook his head skeptically, but said nothing.
There's something else,
Sullivan said, frowning.
I've got a source in Fontaine Futuristics. Tells me about some kind of what they call pheromone experimentation. Something like that can be used to get a handle on those splicers.
He means pheromone, I suspect, Kincaid said, smirking.
Maybe that was it,
Sullivan said, unruffled.
Something about Suchong using those things to control the splicers without the splicers even knowing it. Maybe spraying a chemical that makes them all show up in one place so they cause problems for, well, anybody you wanted to cause problems for, I guess.
Ryan scowled. Control the splicers with pheromones. He was intrigued, but it was troubling too, because Suchong worked for Fontaine. Meanwhile, that Fontaine, in turn, would eventually control at least some of the splicers, and it was becoming clearer Fontaine was a predator. If you allowed him to grab that kind of power, he would use it to take Rapture over. Probably he'd do it behind a smokescreen, as Bill had warned. Fontaine could even partner up with Lamb's followers, now that they were at loose ends. It could mean the destruction of Rapture. Fort Frolic, Fleet Hall, backstage, 1956.
Can anyone ever make you feel like Sander Cohen can? Rapture's most beloved musical artist returns with Why Even Ask, his greatest album yet. Songs of love, songs of joy, songs of passion. Buy Why Even Ask and invite Sander Cohen into your home today.
Hurrying along the empty backstage area, Martin Finnegan chuckled to himself, hearing the public service announcement playing from Cohen's dressing room. Cohen was listening to the PA announcement over and over again. Martin went down the wood-walled corridor, found Sander Cohen seated pensively in front of his gold-framed oval dressing room mirror, putting on another layer of makeup with one hand. With the other, he was shaping the needle-like points of his hooked mustache. Cohen wore a purple and blue silk smoking jacket, silk slippers, and purple silk pajamas. He looked at Martin in the mirror. "I'm running short of makeup, you know," Cohen said. He picked up the stub of an eyebrow pencil and began to darken his eyebrows. "I've asked Andrew for more, but he talks tiresomely of important priorities, the importance of creating our own goods. Does he really expect me to make my own eyebrow pencil? My, you look virile today, Martin." All said while outlining his eyebrow, looking at Martin in the mirror. That face became ever more lurid each time Martin saw it, ever more like a mad mustachioed mime. The recording ended and Cohen restarted it. "What do you think of that announcement?" Cohen asked, starting on the other eyebrow, watching him closely in the mirror. "It's going out tonight on the public address. Trying to push my new record. It seems a bit bland to me, lacking in verve. Doesn't have the libidinous fever that I so delight in." Martin sat in a wooden chair behind Cohen, wishing he'd stop playing the announcement. "I think it's good for regular folks to hear," Martin said. "Kinda family-friendly, like, that's good, you need that." "Oh, God, I hope it doesn't mean they'll bring their children to my shows. I can't imagine how I was able to bear being one. Fortunately, it didn't last long." Martin shifted in the uncomfortable chair, making it squeak. "Speaking of how Sander Cohen can make me feel, the note you sent me mentioned trying something new." "Well," Cohen winked and opened a dressing table drawer and drew out 2 bottles, setting them down on the dressing table, one after the other. They were squat bottles filled with red liquid. Martin knew full well what they were. Cohen opened the lower drawer and took out a flat black box and opened it. In velvet-lined compartments were 2 syringes filled with glowing fluid, Eve, for activating the plasmids. Staring at the bottles, Martin's mouth was dry. He and Cohen had taken cocaine together before, cut with a lot of booze, but this... He had seen splicers. Some of them seemed fairly together. Others, though, were like nitroglycerin, always ready to explode, and then there was the disfigurement. Those who used a great deal of Atom ended looking like they had a skin disease. The loony expressions glued on their faces made it all worse. On the other hand, look at the blue glow in those bottles, the implied power in it.
Well, shall we indulge? Cohen asked, his mouth screwed to a cone and twisted comically to the side.
What the hell? Martin heard himself say. He knew he'd try it sooner or later. He tried everything sooner or later. As Cohen prepared the syringes, Martin found he regretted that his first experience with Atom was going to be with Sander Cohen. The artiste always took everything to crazy extremes. After that last little drunken trip into Arcadia, dancing naked with the Saturnines, forcing a teenage boy to have sex with an octopus, they were all lucky not to be in Rapture detention cells. They'd gotten out one step ahead of the constables. But Martin did want to be a stage performer. So far, the only performance he'd done in Rapture had been at Cohen's Tableaus, where Martin and Hector Rodriguez and Silas Cobb and a couple others dressed in scanty costumes and posed heroically under the artiste's direction, for a very small audience. Many in the audience had been touching themselves obscenely. What was it Hector had said later that night?
Could well be that all art is just a grift after all.
Now, let us partake, said Cohen. This bottle contains Sport Boost and Winter Blast, a splicer cocktail. That's yours. Mine is something very, very hard to get. Teleport. Next, I want to try those spider splicings. Well, what are you waiting for? Bottoms up, so to speak.
Martin took a deep drink from the plasmid bottle. The thick fluid was surprisingly bland, though there was a chemical aftertaste, a bit of saltiness, perhaps a suggestion of the taste of blood. And then... a terrifying rigidity struck him. It was as if someone was running an electric current through his muscles. A charge generated from within his brain, crackling out through his nervous system, and it was making him go rigid. His arching back was threatening to snap his spine. And then he fell to the floor, shaking with spasms, fighting for breath. Waves of dark, hissing energy unfolded in him. He felt high, but he was also terrified. He was distinctly aware that Cohen was dragging down his pants.
Presto plungo,
Cohen whooped, and then came the piercing pain of the needle jabbing into Martin's gluteus maximus. White fire exploded behind Martin's eyes, and it was all he could see for a moment, like gazing into the heart of a welding arc. Unfamiliar tastes, like random chemicals, passed in waves through his mouth. He heard his pulse hammering in his ears, and then a wave of relief came, a ripple of release as the rigidity washed away in a rolling tide of living coolness. After a few moments, he was able to move again, and struggled to his knees.
Now,
Cohen said, laying the empty syringe on the makeup dresser.
I'm going to drink mine. Here's the syringe for me. You do me. I mean the syringe, and don't use your powers yet. You might turn me into a block of ice.
They repeated the process for Cohen, Martin injecting him in the rump, going about it mechanically, even as he struggled for some kind of inner equilibrium. He didn't feel quite real, somehow. Martin set the empty syringe aside and sat gingerly on the chair as the artiste flopped about like a fish on the floor, the Eve merging with the Atom, showing in alternating blue and red energies in Cohen's body. Suddenly Cohen went limp, sighing. Then he sat up, chortled gleefully, and vanished. There was an ambient sucking sound as a thump of air rushed to fill the sparkling vacuum where he'd been.
Sander?
Martin's tongue felt thick. It was hard to talk. His head pounded like a parade drum thumped by a cocaine fiend, but he felt good. Profanely good. A sucking, a sizzling, a Cohen-shaped sparkling, and there he was, materializing at the door to the corridor.
Look, Martin, I did it. I teleported.
It seemed to Martin that Cohen's face was rippling within itself, bumps rising and falling as if little pistons were pumping randomly under his facial skin. Martin laughed. It didn't matter, really, what was happening to Sander Cohen. Nothing mattered. The energy roared like a tornado in the room. The sinews of visible electric power stretched and snapped in the very air. He looked around, expecting to see these powerful forces throwing the furnishings about, whipping things through the air, but nothing was affected. He was seeing these energies in his mind.
Come, follow me. I have a special delight for us in the rehearsal room,
Cohen crowed, whirling about, dancing towards the door.
Come, see my guests.
Guests? What sort, Sander? I'm not sure I can deal with guests. I feel strange.
But you must, Cohen insisted gleefully. This is a test. I test all my disciples. Some shine like galaxies. Some burn like a moth at the flame. Just remember, the artist swims in a lack of pain. Perhaps he evolves into something magnificent. Perhaps he drowns. Will you drown? Or will you come along?
Sander Cohen went out the door, and Martin was somehow swept along behind him, carried by some powerful inner current. He was unable to walk slowly, unable to think slowly. He was a living dynamo of energy.
No wonder people get addicted to this.
The thought came, and he pushed it rudely aside. No raining on the parade, and the parade drum thumped frantically, pacing him down the hall to the rehearsal room at the rear of the backstage area. Cohen had already teleported ahead. Martin felt like he was water skiing, pulled along in a bracingly cold medium by a powerful engine. He burst through the door to the rehearsal room and found Sander Cohen stalking back and forth in front of 3 people. Their arms spread in restraints. They were bound to 3 interlinked metal frames, bolted to the small rehearsal stage. It was all seen through a glass darkly for Martin, a filter-like mental sunglasses that made some bits shine out and muted others. It seemed unreal, almost two-dimensional, like it was all happening to someone else, like a movie. "Please," said a busty, frowsy woman with flapper-style brown hair. She was pinioned on the left side of the practice stage. "Let me go." Her eyes kept fluttering, perhaps because one of them was losing its false eyelashes. She wore a ripped black shift and one red pump, the other foot bare. In the center framework, a middle-aged man with a tondure of white hair shook his bonds in rage and fear. His suit was torn and bloody, his nose was swelling and leaking blood, his left eye swollen shut. Cohen's third guest was a young man in a t-shirt with tousled blonde hair and a little red blonde beard that, along with his green trousers, made Martin think of Robin Hood. He looked like he was drugged or drunk. He just sort of hung there in his restraints, murmuring inaudibly, eyes slitted, lifting his head now and then.
We shall call these 3 Winkin, Blinkin, and Nod, declared Cohen, parading around them, clapping his hands.
I was right. It's a movie, Martin thought. It's not real, none of it.
He was in the audience and in the movie at the same time. It felt good to watch and be the hero of it. "Please, Mr. Cohen," the woman wailed. "I wasn't holding out on tips. The other girls all keep the same amount."
The constables, Hector and Cavendish, caught these 3 for me, Martin, Cohen said, taking a cigarette lighter and a silver cigarette case from the pocket of his smoking jacket. He tapped a button on the case so the cigarette popped out of a little hole. He lipped it up to the lighter, puffed, and blew smoke in Blinkin's face. Cavendish,
Blinken snarled. "That crook. Supposed to be the law, you bought him off." "And isn't that always the case with the best policemen?" Cohen said, putting the cigarette case away. "That Sullivan is such a square. Won't take a bribe, but Cavendish likes my little gifts, doesn't he, Blinken?" "That's not my goddamn name!" the older man shouted. His remaining eye blinked furiously as he struggled with the tight leather restraints around his wrists and ankles. He went angrily on. "You know damn well who I am. I worked for you a good 6 years, Cohen. I did a hell of a job in that crappy little casino of yours." "Oh, but you were skimming the winnings, old Blinken," Cohen said, his voice oily. He toyed with the cigarette lighter. "Ask anybody in Fort Frolic. I was completely on the level," Blinken snarled. "I was totally—" He interrupted himself with a long, peeling scream as Sander Cohen put his cigarette out in Blinken's remaining eye. Cohen made a face at the man's shrieking, and then came that sucking sound. A thump, the sparkling, and Cohen had vanished, only to reappear close beside Nod. Cohen reached out and stroked the young man's blonde hair. "The problem is an artistic one, a compositional question," Cohen said, raising his voice to be heard over Blinken's cries. "Shut that one up now, will you?" "Sure." Martin was glad to do it. Blinken's screams were distracting him from the movie. He strode over to him, took him by the throat, but instead of squeezing, something else came from his fingers. Not quite intentionally. Ice. It spread out from his fingers onto the man's neck, his head, and clickingly up over his chin. It covered his face like a helmet. In another second, it had coated his shoulders, his torso. The man was caught in a carapace of ice. "Stop!" Cohen barked. Martin stepped back, unsure as to what had happened at first. Then he realized that he'd used the plasmid. The power of the specialized atom he'd been given had sent a current of entropy from his fingers, slowing molecules, drawing water vapor from the air, coating Blinken in ice. "If I hadn't stopped you," Cohen said, playing with the lighter, flicking it on and off, "you'd have frozen him right through in another second. This way he's a pretty cocoon of ice, for now." It was true. Blinken was wriggling in the sarcophagus of ice. A little melted water mixed with bloody foam slipped about his face. Cries were muffled. One wild eye was bleeding, the other rolling underneath its blackened, swollen lid. Martin marveled that he felt so little. He was so distant from what was happening, this close in front of him. But the rolling hotness, the transporting sweetness of the plasmid high was still upon him, dominating him, and nothing else was truly real. "Please, mister, don't do that," the woman shrieked. "No, no, no!" Martin turned to see Cohen flicking the lighter under her ragged clothing, her hair, setting Winkin on fire. "We're almost ready, Martin," Cohen crowed as she writhed, shrieking in a growing plume of flame. "You must capture her in ice when she's in just the right posture for the composition. We're making a glorious tableau, a lovely triptych of tragedy, the human condition. I shall entitle it 'Three Souls Revealed.' If only Steinman could see this glorious transfiguration." Martin could barely hear him over the woman's shrieking. Most of her hair was gone now. What was this movie he was in again? What was the title? Martin couldn't remember. "There!" Cohen shouted, leaping with excitement, as she arches her back and howls and spreads her fingers. "Now, freeze her. Just at that point, freeze her right there." Martin stretched out his arm and willed the plasmid to emanate from his fingers. He felt the chill of it passing out of him, saw ice crystals shimmering on the air in front of his hand. Suddenly, the fire around the dying woman was snuffed out. She was instantly frozen solid. Her eyeless sockets, the flame had melted her eyes, filling with pockets of crushed ice. Her mouth agape around a chunk of ice, her singed away hair replaced by icicles. Martin felt a wave of nausea pass through him. He was starting to see that this was real. These people were real. Cohen vanished, teleporting, then reappearing near Blinken, who was just starting to crack out of his ice cocoon.
As soon as he breaks out, when he opens his mouth to shout at us, freeze him, Cohen ordered. Freeze him solid.
At least that would end the man's terror, Martin thought. The thought making him feel sick in itself. This is real. He emanated the entropic power of Winter Blast, and the plasmid quickly froze the man through and through, and Martin shuddered as he was frozen himself. Cohen cackled just before he vanished, reappearing close to the groaning young man, hanging slack on his bonds. Only one panel of the triptych remains. Come play with Nod, Martin. Martin found he was drawn to Nod, that his hands went easily to him. He was a very pretty young man, after all. Cohen took out an elegant little straight razor. Medical Pavilion, Aesthetic Ideals Surgery, 1956. J.S. Steinman was bemused and distracted, admiring the eyeless, limp face he had so deftly removed from the woman's skull, holding it up to the sea light from the windows so that he could see the deep blue of the North Atlantic through her empty eye sockets. Steinman thought, "Aphrodite, your light entering my eyes." And then the visitor buzzer razzed intrusively at him. "Damn them. Why won't they leave genius to be genius?" Steinman muttered, hanging the detached face, complete with her nose and eyebrows, over the lamp beside the operating table. The electric yellow lamplight came prettily through the sockets, but the blood emitted an awful stench in contact with the hot lamp. The buzzer buzzed again. "Wait here, my dear," he sighed to the faceless woman, lying on the operating table. Of course, speaking to her was pure whimsy. She couldn't hear him, she was dead. She'd been a rogue splicer he'd bought from a constable who'd shot her in the head when she tried to decapitate someone with a fish knife. The bullet had left her alive anyway, and she lived until a few minutes ago, but paralyzed, so Steinman hadn't needed anesthetic or restraints to keep her quiet during the carving. He left the operating theater, climbed the stairs, and went through the operating suite's door, locking it behind him. Absently toying with a scalpel, he crossed the small lobby and opened the outer door. Steinman realized he should have cleaned up a bit before answering the door. Frank Fontaine and his bodyguards were standing outside the medical pavilion, staring aghast at his blood-splattered surgical coat and the bloody scalpel in his hand. The booster plasmid he'd been using was starting to make him a bit abrupt. Careless, perhaps. He had gone 3 nights without sleep. "We didn't realize you were, busy, Doctor," Fontaine said, rolling his eyes at his bodyguards, a thuggish sort in a tatty suit, and a grubby long-haired man who looked like a dirty Jesus. Steinman shrugged. "Just some anatomical investigation. Work on cadavers. A trifle messy. Do you wish to schedule some?" "What I wish to do," Fontaine interrupted sharply, "is to come in and talk in private." Steinman gestured with the scalpel. His movement was preternaturally brisk, so the scalpel made a whipping sound as it cut the air. The bodyguards reached for their guns. "Take it easy," Fontaine told them, raising a calming hand. "Wait out here." He stepped into Steinman's lobby and closed the door behind him, but Steinman noticed that Fontaine had his left hand inside the flap of his coat. "No need to be reaching for that gun," Steinman sniffed. "I'm not some lunatic, you just caught me at a bad time." "Then maybe you could put away the scalpel." Oh, yes." He stuck it in his jacket pocket so it stuck up like a comb. "What can I do for you?" Fontaine ran a hand over his bald head. "I'm going to need some work done. Some on me and some on... There's a guy who works for me. Kinda looks like me. I want you to make him look a lot like me."
Probably."
Steinman said, cleaning blood from under his fingernails. I should have to see him to be sure, but you have a distinct face, that helps. That chin, yes. If you want, I might be able to do a face transplant. Yours on his on yours. Has never been successfully done, but I've always wanted to try it. Yeah, well, not a chance. No, just a little painless surgery so I look different. And so he looks like I do now. And I want nobody to know about it but you and me. And I mean nobody. Not Ryan's people, not Lan's people, not even my people. Lamb? You haven't heard? She's got some kind of uprising cooking up in Persephone. I don't trust her. I don't want to know on any of my business. Mum's the word. So, you can make me look different in pretty short order. Painless. And not a freak like some you've been turning out. A good face. A face people trust. Should be possible, Steinman allowed. It'll cost you. I'll need a free supply of plasmids and plenty of cash. You'll get it, but the plasmids come after the operations. I don't want you cracking up all rogue when you're working on me. You already look like you could use some sleep. Steinman waved airily. I work long hours perfecting both my skills and my art. Okay, fine. I'll get you a nice deposit so you're ready to do this at a moment's notice. It'll be soon. Remember, not a word to anyone. Not even to Cohen. He's too close to Ryan. Oh, I see. Fear not. I would not have mentioned it anyway. I am ever discreet. It's part of my professional code. Better be. Or you'll find yourself going headfirst out of an airlock without a diving suit. Now there was the real Frank Fontaine. That icy voice, the even colder eyes, his true colors. Steinman winked conscriptatorily. Fontaine just looked back at him, then went out the door.